Alright, throughout the course of this video, we're going to be talking about fire behavior. I'm going to be throwing out a lot of different new wildfire terms at you. We've got flaming fronts, fireline intensity, flame lengths, heat source, heat sink, all kinds of stuff. But before we get into the vocab, I should maybe lay the foundation of the three main categories of burning. So within a wildfire, there's lots of different factors that weigh into how intense the fire is going to be, what kind of fuels are going to be burning, how fast it's going to be burning. But you can usually break it down into three categories, and that would be ground fires, surface fires, and crown fires. So ground fires, that's often after a surface fire has already come through, and it's kind of the smoldering fire that's maybe going through some duff. It's usually not the most intense part of the flame. The most intense part is usually going to be with your surface fire or your crown fire. Surface fire is going to be what you'd call a flaming front. Flaming front is the leading edge of your fire to the trailing edge of the fire. And then as that moves through, that's your surface fire. And the time it takes to move through from the leading edge to the trailing edge, that's what you'd call your residence time. And then the speed at which it does that is your rate of spread. So I thought I was going to save some of the vocab words for later. We just defined like 4 of them. So we're already off to a pretty good start right there. But you have your surface fire. That's more your classic fire that you'd maybe see on the news. That's where it's going through some grasses. It's going through some brush. Just your fuels on the surface. It's named that for a reason. And you could think of that as your flaming front. Then you have your crown fire, and your crown fire is typically going to be the most intense kind of fire you have, because that's where you have such continuity of fuels, or a ladder fuels, where it goes from grass to brush to tree, and then the fire is able to get up into the treetops, into the canopy, and then it's able to move along the treetops. In some cases, it can move quickly because sometimes the trees can actually be blocking the wind at the surface, so then it can actually be windier up on the treetops. But that, when you have a crown fire, that's when you have a pretty intense wildfire out there, and those are a bit more rare, but when they happen, those you'll definitely see the footage of that on the news. And what is interesting is your crown fire can actually be detached from the surface fire below. It can almost be like 2 different fires moving along. And I'd imagine that creates some complications out there for when you're trying to figure out how to suppress this thing. So that's your 3 main categories. We already defined a few of the words. We've got flaming front, residence time, rate of spread. A lot of that has to do with how intense your fire is as well, which you could call your fireline intensity. That has to do a lot with how much heat is being released. A big part of that has to do with what kind of fuels you have, the rate of spread that you have, maybe how hot it is, how dry everything is. And it also has to do with your flame lengths. So this is our next little round of vocab. I want you to imagine a triangle with a right angle. So the base of that triangle is what you're going to call your flame depth. And then imagine from the ground to the tallest flame that you have on that fire. That is going to be your flame height. You think of that as your right side of the triangle where you have that right angle. And then that hypotenuse that goes from the tallest point on your fire down to the flame base, or where you have the flame depth, that is going to be your flame length. And that ends up being an important term in wildfire. And it plays into all of the other vocab words that we've talked about, like fireline intensity or heat per unit area that's released on the wildfire. And there's actual equations for all of those. I'm not going to go into all the equations in this video because I can't imagine trying to memorize those, speak them back out, and then have anybody actually understand what I was saying. But there's actual equations to figure out how much heat is being released on a fire and basically how intense it is. Since that's a bit complicated, we can just use a very simple model for rate of spread and how a fire moves forward. And you could think of this as the heat source, heat sink model. I believe it came out in forget the exact year that it said in Fire in California's Ecosystems. 1946, that's what it was. And I'm on chapter 4 right now. The heat source, heat sink, you could think of the heat source as your flaming front. That's where the flames actually are. That's where combustion is occurring. The heat sink is going to be the fuels out ahead of the flaming front. Now, as I've talked about in some previous videos, the reason the amount of heat you're generating on your flaming front is so important, the reason wind is so important, the reason slope is so important, is because all of those factors are going to act to preheat the fuels in front of the flaming front. So, for example, if you have a slope, your flames are going to be a little bit tilted uphill, and then some of that heat is going to be closer to the flames above it. So then that's going to dry out some of those fuels and heat up those fuels closer to their ignition point before the flames even get there. And that's the whole preheating process that has to happen before the plants can combust. So if you're just on flat land, a lot of the heat's just going straight up. And then by the time the flame gets to those fuels, they're not ready to combust yet because they still have some moisture in them and their temperature hasn't increased to the ignition temperature yet. So then the fire has to use some of its energy to basically make that happen. It has to dry out the fuels, has to raise their temperature, and then combustion occurs. So that's why fires oftentimes go slower or more slowly on flat land than when you're on a slope. And it's also why fires go faster uphill than they go downhill. When the fire is going uphill, the flames are tilted towards those plants above it, and it's able to preheat them more effectively. Same thing is true. And then on the downhill side, the flames would actually be tilted away from those, so the fire goes pretty slow downhill. It's also why wind is important. So wind is able to take some of the heat from the fire, and instead of all that heat just going up, it's able to push the heat forward to, again, dry out the fuels, raise them up to their ignition temperature. So the wind, I believe that would have to do more with convection, like it's pushing the heat through the air. And then I'd imagine with slope, it probably has a bit more to do with radiation, because it's the heat actually generated from the fire going through, although that could be convection as well. But it's usually through the movement of air. So I think that would be a bit more to do with wind when you're talking about the heat from the fire going into the fuels ahead of it. So that was a long-winded way of saying that you have your flames, you have your fuels ahead of the flames. They can preheat more effectively if there's slope, wind, but then the third one that I mentioned was how much heat you're generating on the fire. Pretty easy to understand, but if there's more heat being generated on the fire, that's going to be able to more effectively dry the fuels. It's going to raise them to their ignition temperature faster, and then the fire is going to be able to combust those fuels the second it gets to them, and you're going to have a faster rate of spread. Now, what is interesting though is I've also previously read in this textbook that if you have a very large amount of fuels that are very densely packed, your fire can actually spread more slowly because it takes so much of the fire's energy to evaporate all that moisture and to raise all those plants to their ignition temperature. And it can actually kind of bog the fire down because it's wasting so much of its energy. So I would imagine there's some kind of sweet spot there where you do probably need a lot of fuels to generate a lot of heat, but then it's also a heat sink, meaning it's taking energy away from the fire. So I thought all of that was fairly interesting. Just a lot of different vocab words out there. But maybe what's most interesting about all of this is the fact that it really is important what kind of fire you're talking about, whether it's a ground fire, a surface fire, or a crown fire. Because if you have a crown fire, that's when you know things are getting pretty serious out there. And that's also a big part of the reason that fire suppression isn't the best policy in California, where wildfire is the enemy. You want to put out fire as soon as it starts. Because if you do that, then the fuels build up, and then you build that continuous, what you'd call ladder fuels, where it goes from grass to brush up into your canopy, and then everything burns when a fire comes through. What's the alternative of that? The alternative of that is like what the natural California ecosystem was like up in the Sierra. You get lightning coming through maybe every 5-10 years, and then you have a lot of trees up there that are adapted to fire, and the larger trees can actually be fine if one of those surface fires comes through, as long as it's not too intense. So if it's every 5 or 10 years, you've had some surface fuels build up, but then lightning strikes, your fire goes through, it clears out those fuels. It can actually pop open the cones on things like giant sequoias. I think pines do it as well. And then those seeds germinate right after the fire comes through. There's no competition. So then those seeds have a very ripe environment for them to be able to make it to adulthood. Versus, so that would be like a healthy environment. You would just have a lot of maybe slow moving, not very intense fires. Versus what happens if we have those lightning strikes, or more times than not, it's actually human ignitions. About 80 to 90% of the fires that are started are caused because of humans. But let's say we put out every single fire as soon as it happens. All of a sudden, those fuels aren't being cleared out every 5 to 10 years, and they continue to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. And then while they're accumulating, now you have all of these fuels sharing the same amount of water that only a few fuels would have been sharing in the more natural ecosystem, in the ecosystem that all of those plants evolved in. So because of that, if you have a large number of things sharing the same amount of a resource, there's less resource to go around, which means your trees are going to be drier. That means they're going to have higher fire danger, because by the time your flaming front gets there, it's not going to have to evaporate as much moisture, kind of bringing back in some of our vocab. It's also just going to make them weaker, more susceptible to things like pests, disease, insects, bark beetles. That's a great example up in the Sierra. We had millions of trees die pretty much because of this. There's obviously lots of different factors that played into that, but that was a big one of them. So yeah, it was a combination of fuel accumulation and a very prolonged drought with very warm temperatures, not enough rainfall. It was kind of the perfect storm, but some of that perfect storm was within our control. So I painted this picture of, we put out all the fires, you have these fuels building up, you have this whole ecosystem sharing not enough water, so everything's dry, and then all of a sudden a fire comes through, and now it's just too extreme for us to stop. It's one of those days where it's extremely hot, it's extremely dry, it's extremely windy, and no matter how hard we try, this fire is going to take off, and all we can really do is get out of the way. Now you have all the fuels that have built up over a long period of time, maybe 50 years, maybe even 100 years. And the reason this is damaging to the environment is now, instead of just having that surface fire that burns along the ground, not very intense, slowly moving, it's actually benefiting the ecosystem a little bit, pops open those seeds, gets them ready for their long life as a giant sequoia. Now the fire is so intense that it goes from the grass to the brush to some smaller trees up into the canopy of maybe your giant sequoias. And now a tree that was adapted to fire, that survived maybe thousands of years because of its fireproof bark, because of its self-pruning mechanism, now its natural defenses are overwhelmed and the giant sequoia dies. So I made a video in the past where I said giant sequoias are fireproof, but that was technically incorrect because they're fire resistant. If you have small fires, they're basically fireproof, but if your fuels accumulate to the point where when you do have a fire, it's so intense that it overwhelms the giant sequoia's natural defenses, that's not fireproof, that's more fire resistant. And in that environment where fire has been suppressed, that fire resistance is not going to be enough. And instead of having maybe more frequent small fires that could benefit the landscape, we have infrequent, which you could say is maybe a good thing, but then they're extreme fires that burn almost everything. So it's up to you to decide which one you think is a better option. I am personally in the camp of it'd probably be better to have small, less intense fires that are more frequent than to have massive ones that destroy everything and are much more dangerous. But that's just my opinion, but I'm sure I will learn a lot more about all of this and maybe improve my thinking on these issues as I continue through fire in California's ecosystems. So if you want to learn more about wildfire as well, you can join me on this journey, and thanks for watching.